Hello everyone. I'm here with my first video recorded specifically for YouTube, and I'm excited to share one of my biggest limited takeaways of this past year. So in previous years, I've been mostly playing Premier Draft, but in 2025, I've been playing a ton of Sealed, and also had the opportunity to play in a few high-level draft pods as well. I think in those scenarios, like you're quite often kind of forced to or pushed towards playing these kind of filler level middling creatures, or maybe even worse, just because the card quality is a bit lower. And these were six cards that really stood out to me in this past year. Either I was playing with them, against them, or I was watching someone play with them, and it really kind of perplexed me as to like why, because these cards also have like really terrible win rates on 17 lands for the most part. And I was really trying to figure out like how do I identify like what decks actively want these cards, and like how can you build around these cards, and just why were they so good in these scenarios that I saw them in. Right. So a little bit of backstory first. So at the beginning of Edge of Eternity's format, this was a common scenario that came up for me a lot. Is it'll be turn 2 Virus Beetle and turn 3 Graphic Modalist, and I'm crying, right? Because I have removal, but I don't have any good targets for them. But then on turn 4, they drop the color, and suddenly I'm jumping for joy, because I can either like reboot with tempo, with bombard, I can maybe push through some damage with relations, or I can get some card advantage with the plunge. So in this scenario, Stormcaller looks pretty terrible, and the 17 lands data would also agree with me, as a game in hand win rate of 52.4, pretty awful by 17 land standards. So my takeaway was like, oh, this card is just terrible, right? That's it, end of story, surely. Then I came across this video call with John Emmett Elderprez, who you don't know, 2023 world champion, really incredible limited player. And he was talking about his white black control decks. So one thing he mentioned was that he likes white Swarmcaller in these like white black control shells, and this like completely shattered my worldview of this format. And it's like, okay, what's going on here? So I think he mentioned that he liked it with nutrient block, but I don't believe he touched upon Swarmcaller more than that. So this kind of bothered me. I was like, okay, what does the world champion see in this card that I'm missing? That 70 lands data is also missing. And you can identify like some synergies here, like the block, the delicacy, vote out taps the color, you make some tokens with the luminary, but I think there's something more to this deck that it really makes Stormcaller really strong, and that's what I'm going to delve into in this presentation. All right. So the conclusion I came to has to do with Muldrifters and Baneslayers. So this is a big concept in the cube community. Every creature is either considered a Muldrifter or a Baneslayer. So Muldrifters generate some kind of advantage, usually the turn they come in. So like Virus Beetle makes your opponent discard a card, Wayfarer draws you a Ramping Growth, Codecracker Hound does a sleight of hand, and then Baneslayer Angels, they don't. They don't generate value the turn they come in. Which means that like if you play a Caveron Skywarden and your opponent plays a Gravkill, it's not great, right? On the surface, at least. There are also some Baneslayers that could hypothetically generate value the turn they come in, but realistically, the majority of the time they don't. Now, for the purposes of this presentation, we're just going to treat like Territorial Bruntar and Sunborn as just Baneslayers. Another point, notably, is that Muldrifters tend to be pretty good in limited. These are, I think they're just inherently better, but also I think Wizards also tends to push these kinds of cards more because probably the gameplay is pretty good and more exciting, more fun. And Baneslayers, a common at least, they tend to be pretty bad, expensive, and cards that you don't really actively want to be playing. Um, At higher rarities, though, they do get maybe a bit better, like the Sunborn. Now, that said, Muldrifters are harder to come by, and Baneslayers are typically pretty easy to get late. So, um, if you can really take advantage of these Baneslayers, then you could have like a pretty consistent winning drafting strategy, right? All right. Now we're going to be looking at a Muldrifter hand versus the average limited hand. So at the top here, we've got three Muldrifters, Beetle, Faithful, and Luminary. And at the bottom here, we have what I'm calling the average limited hand. That is a mix of creatures and removal. So what's the curve out like? So on turn 2, maybe we play the Beetle, maybe we warp Luminary. Turn 3, we play the Faithful and draw some cards, and then turn 4, we play Luminary. And this looks really strong against the average limited hand, right? So what it does here is that it pretty much completely invalidates this graph kill. There's a chance they just might not ever cast this over the course of the game. And if they do, then we're virtually up a card. It also gives them fewer options to choose between if this doesn't ever really become a good card to play. If they do choose to cast this card, let's say on Luminary, then we're still up in the exchange. They spent 4 mana, we spent 4 mana, but we get a free 1/1 out of the deal. And that's where we get these like little incremental advantages. It's just by invalidating parts of their hand, just by running cards that are all Muldrifters. Right, now let's look at a Baneslayer hand. So we've got Flight Deck Coordinator, Crasher, and Sunborn, 3, 4, and 5. How does this stack up against the average limited hand? Well, let's say they use Gravkill on the Crasher. Then we have a Sunborn, 4/5 lifelinker. And that pretty much invalidates parts of their hand as well, just like the Muldrifter hand. Not as strongly or as definitively as the Muldrifter hand, but the Wayfarer and the Pollinator, they can't attack into a 4/5 lifelinker, and they can't outrace the 4/5 lifelinker either. If they use the Gravkill and they save it for the Sunborn, then maybe this Crasher can get a 2-for-1. We get a landfall trigger, then it's a 5/4, they double block, and we kill 2 creatures for our 1. And that's also a way to accrue card advantage here too. If they grab kill the Sunborn, we're winning the race just because we have bigger creatures as well. Alright, let's go back to that example from earlier. With the context of what we learned, now we understand that this curve out consists of both Muldrifters and Baneslayers. And this is where weaknesses can start to appear. So the 2 and 3 drops previously invalidated the removal that we had at hand. But now that they dropped the 4-drop Baneslayer, now that's kind of effectively unlocked all of our removal. And suddenly all the virtual card advantage that we accrued earlier in turns 2 and 3 is now gone. This isn't to say that you can't ever combine Muldrifters and Baneslayers, quite the opposite. It happens a lot. But if you are running Swarm Color and it's kind of black shell, then you probably should try and do so with intent. Like Swarm Color here can make sense if on turns 5, 6, and 7 you're also dropping big creatures, right? Because then eventually you will exhaust your opponents of removal. Alright, now let's look at Baneslayers at common in the Plague Booster era. So for better or for worse, Plague Booster sets tend to be a little more formulaic than they have in the past. Apparently nowadays we always get a 4-mana 4/4 at common. And also like just a random big green creature. So naturally, these kind of Baneslayer decks, Baneslayer cores, they tend to happen pretty naturally in green. If you've ever drafted a green deck in the Play Booster era, you've probably built some kind of Baneslayer deck or a deck with a big Baneslayer component. However, the other colors don't naturally have these kind of Baneslayer strategies at common very often. Cameron Skywarden, for example, doesn't really have a great partner at common for these kind of strategies. It does have some creatures at uncommon, like the Molecular Modifier, which attacks as a 3/2 for a strike. It's kind of hard to answer. in creature combat, so it's easier to just point a removal spell at it. Same with Weftsucker Arden, which might not even attack, and the Territorial Bruntar, which is 6 mana 6/6, pretty large. These are all uncommons. That's to say that it might be difficult to assemble strategies that effectively use these kind of random big common creatures. Um, but keep your eyes open for like uncommons, and maybe if you're red green, then that's maybe a good time to like play these random big creatures. Like if you're like lacking 5 drops, for example. One thing also to note is that sometimes the text on these like big Baneslayers can be a bit of a trap. I think when you're evaluating whether this card should be in your deck, should probably primarily be because it's a 5 mana 4/5 with reach. And yes, this void text does kind of matter, but um, this shouldn't be like the huge impetus behind putting it in your deck. I don't think this really shines with like a deck with like a bunch of virus beetles that you're stacking, for example. Going off that text box idea, got Stormcolor here. So this one makes you sacrifice your own creatures to draw cards. And we've got Servandum here, um, which wants you to have a bunch of creatures. So on the surface of it, doesn't seem like they synergize that well, right? Maybe even anti-synergy, but they do synergize pretty well according to this combo site, off of a bunch of 17 lands data. They have a pretty high win rate when used together. And there are other reasons for it, but I think one of the reasons is because it eats removal, and then that lets your Sylvanum live unimpeded on turn 5. Right, going back to Depress's deck from earlier, now we see that he has double Stormcolor and also Exalted Sunborn and Servandum the Lucent. So I think the idea here is that this color eats removal and then these 5 drops survive. And I think that's probably like at the core of like why Stormcolor is so good here, among other reasons too. I think it's also worth noting the Expansionist tier 2, which attacks as a 2 mana 3/3, is pretty hard to answer on curve. It's much easier to just point like a depressurize at it or invasive maneuvers. But if this Expansionist eats depressurize, then the depressurize isn't being used on the color, so they might have to use Graphical on it, which they can't use on the 5 drops. There's also a Lux Night Breacher here, which also fits the Baneslayer strategy here before you're playing your 5 drops. This is Jim Davis's deck. He won the PTQ pod that I was in at Atlanta. Here we've got double T-Chip Agrarian, which attacks as a 5/5 a good amount of the time. Ice Kick Crasher 5/4. So these are kind of hard to answer in creature combat on curve, so they usually eat removal, which paves the way for like your 5 drops and your 6 drops here. This was either an arena qualifier or arena open, I don't remember, but this was Tarkir Dragonstorm. I was playing against this Abzan deck, a bunch of like middling creatures and no removal, but they played a bunch of them, and I just couldn't answer them. I had Stormblade Entertainment to deal with one of them, but after that, they just kept playing more and more, and I just couldn't deal with that. Um, so I think they're up like 1 card over me, but as far as material goes, like we're pretty even, right? But you know, these cards just invalidate mine, right? The big creatures invalidate these, and also my small removal as well. This is a deck my friend had. At the time, I was like, what? I mean, Wreck Remover makes sense because it's a 4, but like, why was it so strong here? Was the big question I had, and you know, it can potentially eat removal. Maybe it eats a punch spell or a 6 damage burn spell, and then you play Tarion and Ketradon and Archfiend later on that don't get hit by removal. So big conclusion, all these Baneslayer decks they're just stompy decks, right? They're, all the big stompy decks of ages past are just current day limited decks. And this was an arena either open or qualifier day 1. A big decision point for this deck, this was sealed, was between Graveblade Heavy and Alfarial Stone Chosen, and I wasn't really sure at the time which one to include. They both have similar win rates on 17 lands, so I was like really hemming and hawing. I decided to go Alfarial Stone Chosen, but I couldn't really pinpoint exactly why. It felt really strong in this deck in gameplay, and at first I was like attributing it to like, oh, it's synergized as well with Mechanizoa, but I think if you look at it through the framework that we've talked about earlier, then I think it makes a lot of sense. So this deck is pretty strong against creatures. It's got 0 point ballad and singularity rupture. Um, so if we're playing against an average limited hand, then we just clear their board of all their creatures with the rupture and the ballad, and then they have removal spells left, right? Because they're not pointing the removal spells at Grappack Mono as Codecracker Hound or Virus Beetle. Um, so what creature would be better against that kind of hand? And it's not Graveblade Heavy, it's probably Alfarial Stone Chosen. Um, because of the ward ability. And to draw another parallel to Constructed, this is kind of similar to classic white blue control decks of the past, where they play a Wrath and then they play a creature that's kind of hard to interact with. Um, Now, this probably won't come up very often in Limited because these are two rares in a Mythic, I believe. So, but I think this was an interesting point because I think Alfarial Stone Chosen was definitely regarded as a really bad card. It's like maybe the poster child of bad cards for this format. I've heard it come up a lot. It's just like most people are saying like this is a trap, never play it. But I think it does have a home in like maybe 1 in a million decks like this one. I think Terrapact Intimidator is also pretty interesting to look at under this Muldrifter versus Baneslayer lens because it's literally either or. Your opponent can either choose to make it a Muldrifter if they give you Landers, or they can make it a Baneslayer if they put 2 counters on it. There have been endless arguments about this card, about whether or not Landers or counters is like the correct default choice. I think most people thought, yeah, counters is probably the correct choice, and also um, it also depends on like your hand, like if you have removal for it or not. Um, but I think one interesting point is that maybe the deck composition of the player playing Terraback Intimidator also factors in. So when I was playing this deck during the PTQ Day 1 sealed, most of my opponents chose to put counters on it. And I was actually like secretly pretty happy about that. I think that's the choice I would have preferred, given what I had in hand and deck. Because they have to spend removal on this 4/3, because it's a 2 mana 4/3, right? That also means they can't use removal on the Worm or my Menace Landseeker later on. Great. Some key takeaways from the presentation: either build decks to exhaust removal, a bunch of Baneslayers or Baneslayers that strategic 2 points in the curve, or build decks to invalidate removal with a bunch of Muldrifters. Also, build decks with the average limited hand in mind. Again, hand with creatures and removal, and just have a game plan. Like, how do we beat just 2 creatures and a removal spell? Thanks for watching. I have a lot more limited takeaways from this past year and Edge of Eternities especially. So let me know if you'd like to see more content like this. Also, give me any feedback about this presentation. I don't know if it was maybe too repetitive or if it was helpful just seeing like a variety of different ways that this applied to different decks and different players. But yeah, I'll see you in the next one. Bye.